If we're really honest, someone said to me recently, based on some of the stories in the Bible, God would not only fail the equality and diversity policy of any and every local church, if it were possible, he'd also find himself in front of the International Criminal Court in The Hague, prosecuted for crimes against humanity. Why did he say that? Well, for instance, why does the Bible, according to Leviticus chapter 21, insist that God said that no man with any physical disability was allowed to desecrate his sanctuary by his presence? And why does the Bible, 1 Samuel chapter 15, teach us that God ordered Israel to strike Amalek and utterly destroy everything that he had, adding, put to death both man and woman, child and infant, ox and sheep, camel and donkey? So my first principle for understanding the Bible, set out in an earlier video, is that the Bible is a library. It's a collection of books written by a large number of contributors with different understandings and perspectives over the course of at least 1.5 millennia. Put bluntly, therefore, the reason we find some of the primitive stories and statements of the Old Testament so shocking, violent and brutal is simply because they are primitive, shocking, violent and brutal. In fact, if we didn't see it this way, there'd be something wrong with our own moral compass, which of course is still developing in the 21st century. But then we looked at some of the big confusions that have been caused for so many people by imagining that the whole Bible is written as an historic narrative, or that some of it is even a science textbook. All of this led to my second key principle, which is this: to take the Bible seriously is not always the same thing as to take it literally. In fact, the Bible's written in various literary genres, everything from history and poetry, parables and pastoral letters, to legal code and prophetic visions. This week, I want us to explore the last category of issues that I think that people worry about, all of those contradictions. Take, for instance, the story in the Old Testament book of 2 Samuel chapter 24. Its message couldn't be clearer. Speaking of Israel's famous King David, it says, "Again, the anger of the Lord burned against Israel, and he incited David against them, saying, 'Go and take a census of Israel and Judah.'" It's pretty black and white, wouldn't you say? But then in the book of 1 Chronicles, chapter 21, speaking of exactly the same event, there's a very different line. "Satan rose up against Israel," it asserts, "and incited David to take a census of Israel." So there's the dilemma. What do you make of it? There are only two solutions when you think about it. One of these texts could be right and the other wrong, or they could both be wrong. But it's utterly impossible for them both to be right. Or take a look at the two New Testament accounts of the death of Judas, the disciple who betrayed Jesus. Matthew chapter 27 tells us that, torn apart by remorse, Judas tried to return the 30 pieces of silver he'd received in payment from the priests and undo the deal. But unable to do so, he threw the money into the temple, went away, and then committed suicide by hanging himself. Afterwards, Matthew explains that the chief priests took the coins and decided to use the money to buy a field. The book of Acts, chapter 1, however, gives us a very different version of events. It tells us first that with the payment he received for his act of betrayal, Judas chose to buy a field, and that after he purchased it, right there in the field, he fell headlong, his body burst open, and all his intestines spilled out. So what do you make of that? There are only two solutions. One could be right and the other wrong, or they might both be wrong, but it's impossible for them to both be right. over the centuries, there have been many who performed all sorts of torturous textual acrobatics to try and square the impossible, but the obvious still stares us in the face. As C.S. Lewis, that famous Christian and literary scholar, said, it is impossible that every statement in Scripture is historical truth. Now, I'm driven to think about all of this seriously because the Bible matters to me. It really matters to me. My questions are not born of disrespect, but out of the deepest commitment to the Bible. If the Bible is our sacred text, if the Bible's my sacred text, which I understand to be inspired by God, it's my responsibility to deal honestly with it in its entirety. This then brings me to my third key principle. The writers of the Bible did not take direct dictation from God. They were not God's copy typists. The Bible is a collection of books written by fallible men whose work bears all the hallmarks of their human limitations as well as the preconceptions of the times and cultures they lived in. Whilst I understand that some might be fearful in saying these things, that we are somehow dismantling the building blocks of their faith, all I can say is that my goal is the opposite. Let's get real. The Bible is not infallible in any common understanding of that term. And the problem is that to claim it is not only extremely misleading, it sends the world the chilling message that somehow the Bible's text must be blindly accepted without challenge. In truth, of course, there's nothing in the biblical text that's beyond debate and questioning. In fact, healthy churches around the world are always ones that create an environment which welcomes just that approach. So, what do you make of what I've said? And if any of this is true, what about 2 Timothy chapter 3 verse 16, which explains all Scripture is God-breathed and is useful for teaching, rebuking, correcting and training? We'll think about that one next week.